during this week, German Campus Week, which is a series of events that the German Embassy is sponsoring under the banner of Think Transatlantic. So if you're available, on Wednesday evening we have a German trivia night in Toy Lounge, and on Friday there's a German transatlantic or transnational film workshop also here, starting at 1:30. So for now, I'd just like to start with introducing our moderator, Lloyd Kramer, who is the chair of the history department. And just a little bit of information about Dr. Kramer. He's been at Carolina for at least 26 years now. And a few of his interests are a focus on modern European history, with an emphasis on cross-cultural exchange, nationalism, and the construction of cultural identities. Dr. Kramer is the author of an impressive amount of books and articles, which I won't take up your time now listing those, but I do want to thank him for participating this afternoon. And also thank you to the panel in advance for volunteering your time.
Well, thank you, Priscilla, and I want to thank you for bringing us together and organizing this event and giving us a chance to think about transatlantic relations, which have evolved from the fall of the wall to today. And here we are gathering on the eve of the American presidential election, so who knows how things might evolve again. But we know things won't stay the same. We have three panelists who are each going to present some thoughts on what's happening in transatlantic relations, what has happened in recent years, and what this might mean for the future. We've asked them to think about various themes, but we're open-ended in where we go. But some of these themes have to do with the changing role of NATO, or the question of how the U.S. and German economy might stay competitive in the 21st century, the relation of various crises, including the European financial crises or debt crises in Europe, and what that means for transatlantic relations, security issues, all kinds of issues that we could come back to at one point or another. But let me begin by just introducing the three speakers. The first is Liesbet Hooghe, who is a professor here, the Zachary Taylor Smith Professor in the Department of Political Science. She has been at UNC since the year 2000. She taught before that at the University of Toronto and had a PhD from the University of Leuven in Belgium before that. She has also been affiliated with the Free University of Amsterdam since 2004, and she works especially on comparative politics in Europe, but with issues such as identity and political parties and political elites. She's the editor of Cohesion Policy and European Integration, Building Multi-Level Governance, and co-author with Gary Marks of the European Commission, Multi-Level Governance and the European Union. And she has also written a number of scholarly articles and publications. So she will be our first speaker, and then we will go to Klaus Larres, who is a colleague of mine in the history department. He is currently the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor. He received his PhD at the University of Cologne in 1992, and he's an expert on contemporary transatlantic relations. He also wrote a very important book on Winston Churchill. The exact title of that book is Churchill's Cold War, Politics of Personal Diplomacy. And he has written extensively on geostrategic developments in the post-Cold War world, and has an interest in, especially in transatlantic relations and diplomatic exchanges. And our third speaker is Holger Moroff, who is a visiting assistant professor sponsored by the DAAD, right? Is that the sponsoring organization from Germany? He's taught international and comparative politics at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena since 2002, and before that he was a senior research fellow at the Institute for European Politics in Berlin. His research focuses on security theories and European integration, as well as on comparative political corruption. and the internationalization of anti-corruption regimes. Now, there is a subject that never goes away. So, each of these speakers is going to provide some introductory comments, and then we hope to have a discussion beyond that. So, I think we'll start with Liesbet.
Okay, thank you, Lloyd, and
Maybe we need to close. Is that too bright? That
let's see how we do this.
if you wanted to show some images,
Yeah.
we should have a code.
Oh. I don't think you can actually.
Okay. You have to use it. No, it's an automatic.
How does that work for people in the? Let me just. All
Probably see the images.
Seems to be blocked.
Oh, you're looking for
Blind.
the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it seems to be.
Oh.
Well, thanks, Priscilla, for having me here. Thank you very much. Jeff, let's put this one up. And it's a pleasure to be on a roundtable with Lloyd, who actually was the person I taught the first course with when I arrived here. You can see.
That's right.
I mean, it's 12 years ago. And Lloyd, you've also pulled me out because you just reminded me that I badly need to update my website, UNC website. I showed in my title is slightly different. Now it's a Keenan professorship instead of the executive Taylor Smith, so I sent that one home and I got the new one. But I shall do that once after the roundtable, I promise. Okay, my argument essentially is that what is happening is twofold in a sense. One, if you want to understand German-US relations, you have to embed this in understanding EU-US relations, because Germany, both as a result of reality and as a policy choice, really since 60 years, has just tied its fate with the fate of Europe, and I think that's the better way of looking at these evolving relations. The second is that we are, in my view, I need to find how this works, yes. We are, in my view, at a interesting point in transatlantic relations, European-US relations, where both sides are seeking for an angle of repose, you could say. In their changed relations, the relations clearly have changed over the past 10, 15 years. And so my cutoff point would not necessarily be the wall, the downfall of the wall, which was on the poster there, but rather with respect to transatlantic relations, more the Twin Towers, which is what you have here. Which was the first time that NATO invoked Article 5, which was written in the NATO treaty upon essentially the Europeans urging to have it in there to bind or tie the United States to truly be available and support them should they be attacked, in that case from the East, that is from the Soviet Union, which was then seen as the major competitor, of course, and threat. And it's ironic that the article has so far been invoked only once, and it was invoked then after the towers came down in 2001, in order to show the resolve of the NATO allies that they would stand by the United States. Of course, there's a self-interest there as well to make combating terrorism a real priority in both domestic politics and in transatlantic relations. And that was a symbolic moment. I think the transition from a change in changing roles had started before, in the sense that, of course, the United States began in the post-war period as the protector with a capital P, the umbrella under which the Europeans could hide. But as relationships evolved, the relationship has become more, I wouldn't say equal, but less asymmetrical. And particularly then from the US side, there's been an attempt to redefine the terms in terms of burden sharing. I'm not an expert on this. I'm looking at two experts in this particular field, so I'll let them, if they so choose, so say more about this. But the point I want to make is, and a few figures I want to show, is that the US-EU relations, and within that the German relations, are in need of rebalancing, but the rebalancing is somehow in trouble, is somehow not happening in a very smooth way. And what is amiss? And I submit there are three obstacles. Two relatively minor ones, and then one big one. Let me start with the minor ones, in my view, the minor ones. So, by the way, I'm just going to skip this, it's not so good. Minor ones, the first is misconceived economic interests. The transatlantic economy is still by far the biggest market in the world, the largest market, with some close to $5 trillion of sales in 2010 and some 15 million jobs directly affected by this. And still, the rhetoric on both sides, particularly in this election campaign, but also in Europe, has been as if everything is about China. China bashing here, and China rowing over there in Europe. Now that's irrational and economic rents. So here are some figures. This is direct investment. As the percentage of direct investment from the US into other countries, over half of direct investment is going into European countries. And it's barely budged or barely gone downwards. So this is actually by decade, from the 50s to the first data we have for the 2010 decade. So that's one. What we've seen is, and actually direct investment from Europe into the US, about 75% of European foreign direct investment actually goes to the United States. So there's an overwhelming set of close ties between the two economies. And so what we're talking about is the proportion of direct investment from the United States going into Europe versus that going in China. China is the little blue bars. In case you wouldn't notice them, they're actually here. So they're kind of on the small side. So in terms of this is foreign direct investment, which is actually, economists tell me, more significant than pure trade figures, to look at how the economy actually is interconnected. This is still very much a Western economic picture. This is Germany versus US. I'm going to skip over this because we don't have a lot of time. There's about 1.2 million jobs at stake, with respect to German-US direct economic relationships. The second minor problem is, I think, lingering philosophical differences with respect to foreign policy, stemming from the Bush years. And I've got some graphs here from the Pew Foundation that got worried in 2002 and started to monitor transatlantic relations attitudes and public opinion in a number of countries. And so the first is the percentage favorable opinion of the United States. And of course what you see there in the mid-2000s, and this corresponds very clearly with the Bush years, is a clear drop in some key European countries are picked out there, right? And the same with the percentage thinking that the US takes into account the interest of their particular country in international policy. But what you also see, and the first more than in the second, is a recovery of that as of 2009. You find your own reason for why the recovery started in 2009. Right, so I think this was, if we'd had this roundtable 4 or 5 years ago, we would probably have talked about the serious crisis in transatlantic relations in terms of a divergence of opinions and also in terms of how this is reflected in public opinion. This is not quite as serious anymore. It doesn't mean there are no divergences. This is an interesting graph. This is pure fun for me. But this is one where you see a low percentage of support favorable for some years, and then a sharp increase in 2009. And I wonder whether anyone could guess what the question around is. I'm not going to test you for too long. The question is percentage having confidence in the US president. And as you can see, currently, with the sitting president, at least until tomorrow, he's got a career in Europe, she thinks, no doubt. Because there's a gap there, but it's a reverse gap from the one we've tended to see. This is also a fun one. Maybe if the US feels uncomfortable in the world, it might start thinking of joining the European Union. Support for the European Union is actually higher in the US than it is in Britain at this point. It's around 50%. These are just fun things. But essentially the point here is that there was a serious gap in public opinion and elite opinion as well with respect to how to take a position on a number of foreign policy issues in the mid-2000s, and that gap has seriously diminished over the years. There are some lingering foreign policy differences. These are averages up to 2012. There's very little change in public opinion, that's why I just took an average. As you can see, support for the United Nations is significantly lower in the US compared to European countries, but it's over 50% at least, and the same for NATO. There is a gap there, but I wouldn't say it's a humongous gap, but it's certainly there. Where you see perhaps the clearest difference is this: the percentage that countries saying that a country should have UN approval before using military force. And then the first time point we had was 2004, and of course the context there is the Iraq war, right? So this was very palpable. And there you do see a clear distinction there between the European countries and the US. And we know that in Europe this has translated in terms of treaty language that specifically says that military interventions should happen within the context of the UN approval. It's very close treaty language with that respect. And I think that's something that remains a very noted difference between the two. But I'd say both the economic and the political differences have diminished, not disappeared, but they probably are not sufficient anymore to explain why this transatlantic rebalancing doesn't seem to be happening in a serious way, in a smooth way. And I think for me, the biggest issue is a European issue, an internal European issue. And that is the existential crisis that Europe is going through at this point. And I just want to flag it here. We can talk more about this in question time if you're interested. But it seems to me there's two very big issues at play here, and both lead to the same thing, and that is they are eroding the kind of coherent capacity of the European Union to be a player and to project itself so much. This is a question July 2012, so the most recent Eurobarometer data. I'm a skeptic of the Eurobarometer data, but as long as we don't have better ones, I'm going to use them. I think broadly speaking, they pick up something that's very real. The question is, in general, does the European Union conjure up for you a very positive, fairly positive, neutral, fairly negative, or very negative image? And what you need to look at is the blue line and the red line. The red line is negative, the blue line is positive, right? And they almost touch. It's almost like looking to the public opinion also for the election time over time. And the big two issues are, very briefly, the euro crisis, which is the biggest of all, which is has very massive effects on the capacity of the European Union to project itself as a global player, and it's essentially the massive policy of political failure in addressing this is eroding whatever moral superiority that Europe built up in the 2000s very quickly. And this is not working. And the second one, and again it's something I'll just I hope that my two partners here are going to say more about, is the foreign policy stalemate. Experts tell me that common foreign and security policy, it's now named differently, is not working. And there's a number of reasons for that, but essentially there seems to be an incapacity to develop common European foreign policy. And if that is impossible, then I think it's going to be very difficult to think of how this transatlantic balance, this sharing of burdens and also of responsibilities could be negotiated with the US. So essentially the United States doesn't seem to have a proper counterplayer, counterpart.
Our next speaker will be Klaus Larres. Thank you. It was very helpful and very concrete images that you gave us. Very apropos of the eve of the American election also.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for Priscilla for organizing this event, for Lloyd Kramer for chairing it, and for my fellow panelists for, well, having, going to have a lively and heated discussion soon, I hope. If it was up to the Europeans, of course, then if they could vote, then Bill Clinton would still be president. So, to just clarify that. Transatlantic relations are, of course, in crisis to some extent, for reasons of the euro crisis and for other reasons. On the other hand, transatlantic relations always have been in crisis. So there is nothing new, really. And when you look at the 1950s was supposedly the golden age of transatlantic relations with the establishment and then the development of NATO in 1949 and so on. But even in the 1950s, transatlantic relations were in crisis. We had the EDC crisis, where the Europeans tried to set up a common European army, which failed disastrously, much to the displeasure of the United States. We had the Suez crisis, where the French and the British invaded Egypt without even the knowledge, and certainly without the cooperation of the United States. That was a big crisis. Then later in the 1960s, we had the French withdrawal from NATO in 1966. That was an even bigger crisis. So if you look at the 50s and 60s, these horrendous years, or these heroic years of transatlantic harmony, there always was a crisis. And in my view, I think the real turning point occurred in the late to the early 1970s. At that stage, the Europeans kind of emancipated themselves a little bit. They developed a greater independence from the United States. And that, above all, happened for economic reasons and currency monetary reasons. Until that period of time, the United States, there was, of course, a nuclear umbrella, which the Europeans were dependent on in view of the perceived threat from the Soviet Union. But also in economic terms, the Europeans weren't really competing. They hadn't really the potential to compete. That changed in the course of the 1960s, not least severely influenced by the Vietnam War and America's overstretch, both military and economic resource overstretch because of the Vietnam War. That meant that the United States neglected its economic development, its creativity, and it also neglected its currency. The dollar really became weaker and weaker, while the European currencies, including, or above all, the West German mark, became stronger. And also European economic potential and economic development also was becoming quite competitive. So by the early 1970s, the Europeans were actually active rivals and competitors to the United States. Not, of course, in the nuclear sphere or military sphere, but in the economic and also in the monetary sphere. And that had important repercussions. That gave the Europeans much greater self-confidence, and they actually dared to take on the United States in an intra-alliance way. And that continued throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And as you can imagine, that increasing rivalry, that increasing competition didn't lead to very harmonious transatlantic relations. So in the 1970s and in the 1980s, transatlantic relations were also in crisis. So throughout the Cold War, to cut a long story short, throughout the Cold War, transatlantic relations were never really particularly harmonious. They were always driven by crisis. Some years were worse than other years, but there never was really that golden age. And then we had the end of the Cold War, German unification, the integration of the whole of Europe into a united European house. And there were perhaps for a few months, but there was harmony and everyone was very pleased. The Bush administration supported German unification very actively. But of course, even at that crucial period of time, in late 1989, early 1990, the British didn't want to know about it. And the French only very hesitatingly eventually supported unification. So to speak of transatlantic harmony, even then, is, I think, a stretch. Even then, it was not particularly harmonious. And then in the 1990s, when we had the Maastricht Treaty and the development of a European foreign and security policy, and for a few years, the end of the Bush administration, Bush Senior administration, the early Clinton years, there was actually a fear in the United States, at least apprehension, that the Europeans would really develop into a serious rival, not just in economic terms, but also in military security terms. However, then we had the Bosnian War, and later on the Kosovo War, and quickly turned out the Europeans were totally incapable. they had no, and also they lacked the will. It wasn't just being militarily incapable, which they were. They couldn't get their act together, not even the leading military countries in Europe, Britain and France. But there also was a lack of will as far as Brussels was concerned to really be a decisive voice in international affairs. So the 1990s reassured the United States, if you like, that the Europeans were not serious rivals in the military and security sphere. And ever since, of course, that situation has continued. As we just heard, the Euro crisis, of course, has had an important impact on whether or not the Europeans can be a player in the world. But I think we also have to consider the fact that the Europeans do not want to be a global player. It is not just a lack of ability, a lack of competency, a distraction by the Euro crisis. That is all part of it. But I think decisively, the Europeans do not want to compete with the United States on a global field. There are several reasons for that. In the German case, of course, you have the legacy of the Nazis and the Holocaust and what the other European countries would think if the Germans suddenly became uppity and tried to be a leader of Europe again. But there's also a resource requirement. If you develop a strong military force, you have to spend much more than 1.5 or 2% of your GDP on the military. The United States, as you know, spends close to 4%, which is a lot more. And no European country, including Britain and France and the Germans, has any intention to get there. In theory, sometimes they say, you know, when they give a nice speech on Sunday, that would really be desirable, we really want to get there. No one really wants to do that. They're actually cutting the defense effort, they're not increasing it. So competition with the United States to be a global player or even a serious partner is actually not what the Europeans have in mind. On paper sometimes. And some, of course, individual politicians, individual bureaucrats, they come out with that idea and say that is what we really want. But that is not the majority view. It certainly is not the majority view among the European populations. And they, of course, as we know, they in the end call the shots by voting or not voting for certain politicians. Therefore, I think the Europeans will only remain a junior partner to the United States at best. They will never be an equal or a really serious partner. Having said that, I think it's not all doom and gloom. When we talk about the pivot of America to Asia, to China, then I think we also have to bear in mind that we shouldn't exaggerate that and overplay that. When we look at international crises in the world, it is not Asia, it is apart from Japan, it is not Asia, it is certainly not China who are really a reliable partner in American foreign policy. Whenever the United States needs a reliable partner, it would be the Europeans they turn to. Sometimes individual European countries, particularly Britain, of course, also France and Germany. Sometimes it's the EU as such, but it usually is a European country or the EU. Think of Afghanistan, think of North Korea, think of Iran, think of the downfall of the Gaddafi government in Libya. Now think about what is happening in Syria. There are, of course, serious talks with Turkey as well, but Turkey is a member of NATO. It certainly is at least a semi-European country, I would say. Therefore, the United States always will continue, at least for the foreseeable future, will continue to look at Europe. Europe is not an equal partner, but it will remain a very important junior partner. It also provides a certain moral alibi to the United States, that the United States is not doing it all by itself, but that there is support, and that support is coming from Europe. It's not coming from India or China or other countries. You know, I think the reliability factor is much, much higher regarding Europe. So in summary, I would just like to say, transatlantic relations are in crisis, but transatlantic relations have always been in crisis. It's nothing new, and I don't think we need to be unduly worried about that. Secondly, the Asian pivot, the pivot towards China, should not be exaggerated either. In the last resort, the United States has no choice but to continue looking to Europe as a serious junior partner, but not as an equal partner on the world stage. Thank you.
And now we'll go to Holger Moroff. Yes, thank you.
This is a very broad field, and I try to scan the horizon and come up with some provocative statements that will hopefully stir questions and debates, and I leave it up to you where you want to dig deeper and try to find the analytical background behind those statements. I would start with the statement that if the Cold War was about alternative political and economic systems, then today the only credible alternative political and economic systems or policies are in the EU or in the EU member states, at least from the US perspective. So there might be a reason why the EU is ignored so much, not only this election campaign, but in general, by the US media and in public debates, and maybe our turnout today is an indicator of that. I believe framing is of great importance. Spin is of great importance. And I will start with how Europeans, Germans, perceive the United States. Liesbet Hooghe gave us a great statistical analysis on this and survey data. I would draw your attention to today's Spiegel. That's the German weekly, the main standard, most established German weekly, slightly left-leaning. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to give you color print. It shows Uncle Sam on the sick bed with a thermometer and an infusion, and the title reads, Der amerikanische Patient, the American patient, vom Niedergang einer großen Nation, about the decline, the demise of a great nation. And I give you the subtitles of this rather long piece, and there is an English translation of it. Since about a year we get the Spiegel in English. Okay, first subtitles. No system to protect against storm surges, a land of limited opportunities, a lack of strength, 2 hostile camps, a systemic crisis, dropout factories, one dead end after another. America falls behind. In today's America, long-term goals stand no chance, losing ground. And those are large sections, that's why I hold it up. Right. Economic crisis forces foreign policy rethink, the mother of all austerity measures. The beginning of the post-American world, 1.5 pages. Right. This is a weekly paper, so that's quite some substantive reading to do. And I will close with the Heritage Foundation's take and perception of Europe and the EU. But in between, I want to point out a few things. Of course, maybe some of the authors haven't seen the Colbert Report or the Michael Moore movies, since the strongest critics of America and American imperial policies are inside, and this makes it more difficult to criticize from the outside, which is a nice insulating factor in any society. Okay, I will give a brief position on the Arab Spring, on the economic relations between the US and the EU, the Euro crisis, Asia, and close with the Heritage Foundation's perspective that was just published last week. When I worked in Brussels in the Council of Ministers, the US was never talked about. Right? The Russia was talked about, China was talked about, the US was never talked about. And I got the feeling this is the significant other. The significant other, the elephant in the room, the skeletons in the basement, they're not mentioned. You tread around it. For good reasons, I would say. It's the significant other for historical, cultural, linguistic reasons, but also for the depth of economic integration, which is unmatched by any other relationship. But neither the EU nor the transatlantic relationship really lends itself to be politicized, to be debated, to be doubted, to argue about. And my thesis is this is why we might have a low turnout, and this is why this most important of relationships is not very well publicized. In the wake of 9/11, the EU was perceived as being split along the lines of old and new Europe, right, rule and divide. But this grabbed the media headline. But behind this split in external policy, there was an integration push, really remarkable in the field of police and judicial cooperation. The European arrest warrant was agreed upon, Eurojust, Eurolex, Europol was strengthened dramatically, things that were unthinkable before 9/11. So you have an external shock that actually led to deeper integration in one field, whereas of course the media attention, the framing, focused only on another field. Okay, you asked us for the roundtable to look at NATO and the new perspectives of NATO. It certainly moves beyond and transcends the collective defense, Article 5, that was invoked in 9/11 once, to an organization that seems to now develop two kinds of strategies. First one is the responsibility to protect. We saw this in the Yugoslav wars, especially in the Kosovo crisis, where NATO was used on a value basis to prevent the genocide in Kosovo. On the other hand, it is also used as, very reluctantly, a means for preventive, preemptive war efforts. And which road will take the upper hand in NATO is very much unclear. Interestingly, I find it that realists, IR scholars, would have predicted the demise of NATO in 1990 with the end of the Cold War, since there was no common enemy anymore, so why should we have a collective defense? Whereas another group of thinkers, the German Green Party, the pacifist Green Party, that wanted to dismantle NATO in the 1980s and wanted to take Germany out of NATO in the 1980s, all of a sudden discovered NATO. And we find a constructivist term in the justification of NATO's existence, and I think it's exemplified by the former foreign minister of the Green Party, Joschka Fischer, who changed the entire discourse of his formerly pacifist party at a party convention where he said, "It is not never again war originating from German soil." So again, you have this very constructivist German history as the background. He turned it around by saying, "Never again Auschwitz, never again genocide." And in this way justified that he, as a foreign minister of Germany, would support NATO out-of-area operations in Kosovo to prevent the ethnic cleansing that is going on. So NATO, from a very hard-nosed realist organization, turning into a somewhat less hard-nosed constructivist operation, which still doesn't know where it will go in the end. You asked us for some comments on the Arab Spring, and I thought about it, and I was intrigued by the question, this is the third kind of transition Europe experiences in its neighborhood. The southern enlargement, we had the authoritarian fascist market economies of Spain, Portugal, Greece joined the Union. Then we had the eastern transition, double transition, political and economic, right, from planned economy and authoritarian regimes, communist regimes. And both of these transitions, the EU really managed quite well. And the reason why I'm very skeptical about the Arab Spring is only one-fold. I believe that in Eastern Europe you had rather modern secular societies, they with the exception of Poland. That means there was no claim to absolute or superior truth by any religious organization. And in this way you had rather modern societies. In Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, the church was in collaboration with dictators and therefore discredited. Right? So the opposition against the regime was also the opposition against the Catholic Church in Spain, right? Which helped secularize these societies rather rapidly. In the Arab world, right, around the EU, this is not the case. The religious groups were always part of the opposition to the dictatorial regimes, and therefore they are not swept away with the old dictators being swept away. And this makes for a much more difficult situation. But it's a provocative comment, so we have to see. To NATO, of course, the old reason for NATO was keep the Americans in, the Russians out, the Germans down, right? And all of these reasons have become less so. Less America in, less Russia out, and less Germany out. But where it will stand, that's another question. To the economic relations, we heard already the great numbers, and I can only underline that. Of course, why do the media not pick up on this, or politicians, right? It takes genius not to see it. The EU and the US are each other's largest trading partner. Export, import, direct investment, right? The concept of complex interdependence was developed for these two regions. Well, the reason is, of course, that media and politicians like to just look at member states, right? So Germany or France or Italy, and ignoring that it is one big common marketplace with one external tariff. It is a customs union after all, right? So there's certainly one easy way out to ignore it, or to be able to ignore this outstanding fact. Of course, if you deal a lot with each other, you have a lot in common, but you have also a lot to quarrel about. And this is borne out by the fact that the US and the EU are the most frequent litigators within WTO, whether it's hormone-treated beef or GMOs, or whether it's Boeing versus Airbus and state aid. However, they are also the only political entities that have mutual recognition agreements in various fields, like antitrust, what is called competition policy in the EU. You have the example of the very important impact of the EU market on the American producers. Microsoft was forced to take the Explorer from its operating base, right? Google nowadays will be forced to open up its data collection policy. So there are very strong impacts of the high preventive regulatory system in the EU on US producers. Almost a race to the top in the regulatory globalization regime. It's a very interesting topic. Related to that, of course, is the euro crisis. And my provocative statement here is, if the US and Japan were members of the Eurozone, the US would be talked about like Spain and Portugal are talked about today. And Japan would be talked about like Italy is talked about. And this is only if you look at the numbers of deficits, the annual budget deficits, and the total number of government debt. Right? Japan debt, 200% of GDP, is mostly held by domestic lenders, similar in Italy and in Spain. Actually, Spain has a public deficit of 4.7%, the US has an annual deficit this year of 8 point something percent, double that. So, if you look at these two figures, which are usually quoted in the newspapers, the US and Japan should be in much bigger trouble. Also, Great Britain. The reason why they are not is because they are sovereign, and they are sovereign currency countries. Their central banks can and do buy government debt, right? To the tune of 60% of the new issue treasury bonds of last year was bought by the Federal Reserve of the United States. Something unthinkable for the European Central Bank until a few weeks ago. The Eurozone member countries cannot force their central bank to buy government debt. Whereas the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve do so. Again, it's a matter of spin, of framing these issues. At the end of the day, if you just look at the deficit and total amount of government debt to GDP, the situation would look much different if you took these other countries into consideration. Well, the US, of course, can afford it because it has by far most important reserve currency. But what is very often overlooked is that the US dollar is the only currency for commodity trade. Right? If you want to buy oil or gas or copper or coal or corn, whatever, you need to have dollars. And this comes with seniority problems. The dollar printing central bank can and must do this and will reap the seniority profit of it, which is something the euro cannot do. Okay, very briefly, on Asia and the importance of China, I want to look at this from a security perspective, since we covered the economic side already somewhat. I do believe the US provides stability up to now in Asia, in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. It is a security guaranteeing power. And the EU profits immensely from this. China is also the EU's largest trading partner and vice versa. Right? And the EU profits immensely from the political stability the US actually assures in Asia. And it is in the EU's interest not to thwart the EU's ways. This is why the arms embargo against China, I will not believe that it will come down, even though China tries to buy Greek debt and Italian and Spanish debt and wants to get the arms embargo cancelled. This will not happen, I think, because of this symbiotic relationship between the EU and the US and China. You could also say the EU is a free rider in East Asia on the EU security guarantee. As far as value divergences are concerned, which Liesbet Hooghe mentioned in the beginning, I think there is a very important point which survey statistics bore out quite nicely. And this is the one of just wars. The philosophy on just wars. After World War II, the concept of a preventive war was debunked by Eisenhower and others. They could have used nuclear arms to prevent the Soviet Union or China from going nuclear. They did not do this because the idea of preventive war was not part of the just war concept. This has changed with the Bush administration. We have preventive concepts for rogue states, whoever defines what a rogue state is, and so forth and so on. And this is the main value clash within NATO, I would see today. And for Germany, it would certainly take quite a development to accept at least a restricted version of preemptive and preventive interventions. But this is something that will have to be decided in the next few years with the future of NATO. And Germany will remain inside of it. Okay. Last but not least, the Heritage Foundation, you can look it up, right? Came out with its perspective on the EU. Forget the EU. It isn't important. Just talk to the United Kingdom, to Poland, and to the Czech Republic. Let the euro fail, because it might be a competing currency. This was the debate from 10 years ago, right, when they thought it might drive the dollar away from the reserve currency, also as a commodity currency. And we know Saddam Hussein switched to sell oil in euros just half a year before the Iraq invasion, and many people said, okay, the US also wants to prevent the euro from being used as a commodity trading currency. The EU was actually part of the whole scheme to contain Germany. Now the EU is Germany. This is a strong statement in the Heritage Foundation. Something the French, at least as far as the euro goes, would also sign on to these days to a certain extent. The euro was there to contain the German mark, and now it seems that they gave the German government a lever to influence things much more than before, at least for the moment. So far, some spotty small statements, since you want to have a tour of the horizon. That's the horizon. The sun is setting, though.
Well, I want to thank each of the panelists for their comments, and they've raised a number of issues, including the euro crisis and security issues and NATO and so forth. So maybe we could just open the floor to some questions or comments, and then I'd like to come back to each of the panelists. So, are there any opening questions? Yes, go
I'm
ahead.
going to go for it. We've already mentioned NATO, and that's the big transatlantic institution. The European Union does not, as far as I know, have a member state on this side of the Atlantic yet, and so NATO is really there to bridge the gap. But we've already mentioned as well, after NATO, after the 1990s, trying to figure out the reason of being in NATO and trying to find a common threat, since Russia, the Soviet Union, was no longer the common threat. And then we also mentioned common foreign and security policy, trying to get European countries together to have a common policy, but of course that common threat was gone, and the kind CFSP really was trying to come of being in the 1990s, which is probably a time that NATO probably couldn't have come into being. I think that's something I've noticed, and I'd like to hear your perspectives on that.
Who would like to respond?
The collapse of CFSP. Well, CFSP, of course, came about for two main reasons. One is the Yugoslav War, so you had the secessionist civil war at the doorsteps of Europe, for which Europe was not prepared to deal with in any way. And the other one was, of course, the end of the Cold War and the German problem, which resurfaced to a certain extent. So one tried to capture this new strengthened Germany into some kind of embedded security system. From the very beginning, and this goes back, as Klaus Larres mentioned, to the 1950s, the US was very keen on having the supremacy in the defense field. Right? And the Berlin Plus agreement, which regulates the relationship between NATO and the CFSP, the European Defence Pillar, gives the right of way to NATO. Right? It states clearly only if NATO doesn't want to or cannot intervene, then the EU can use NATO joint command and strategic capabilities, and does its and only then can the EU step in to its work, or military work. And you can see that CFSP is a reaction to external shocks, the civil war, Kosovo in '98, leading to the Saint-Malo agreement between France and Britain, then 9/11, leading to battle groups between 2 and 3 countries. So even the structure of how this thing looks like is a reaction to external events.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. But as you know, already the Rome Treaty foresaw political union in Europe, and that has never really left the agenda. So it got buried occasionally, was then revived, and it got revived again with the Maastricht Treaty of 1991, 1992. So political union is very much on the horizon, at least as far as the EU Commission is concerned. And the EFSP is part of that. How can you have a political union without some sort of common European foreign policy and also security policy? But I don't think that the European security policy can ever challenge NATO. At times, of course, there were conflicting opinions. There was for a few years that was on the agenda that should be the case. But I think that has, as you rightly said, that has long since disappeared. While some sort of more European foreign policy and security unity is certainly desirable to be achieved, I don't think it is a competitor to NATO. And you will know NATO remained in peace after 1990. For one reason, bureaucracies are very difficult to abolish, and the military and the promotion developments, that made it all very important to have NATO, to be based in NATO. Then, of course, the United States likes NATO. The United States sees NATO quite rightly as the one organization where it has hegemony, leadership in Europe. And that is the only serious European institution the United States actually involved in. So why abolish it? And on the other hand, the Europeans still like NATO for security reasons. That particularly applies, of course, for the new European countries who joined the EU only recently, the Eastern Europeans. Russia is still seen as a threat. And Putin's Russia is, of course, behaving much more aggressively now than Yeltsin's Russia did. So the threat from Russia, we in the West don't really take all that seriously. If you live in the Balkans, if you live in the Baltics, if you live in Poland or the Ukraine, as we recently heard, or Georgia, then Russia is very much the big hegemon just around the corner. So NATO is a reassurance, both for the member states, like Poland, but also for states who are not actual members, but would like to join, like Georgia or the Ukraine. But having NATO nearby, contains the threat. And I think there's no prospect, and probably I don't think it would be sensible to get rid of NATO at this point at all. And what you said about the free rider principle, I couldn't agree more. I think that doesn't just apply to Asia, but it applies to the whole world. The EU is a free rider to American security and foreign policy on a global way. It's, as I tried to outline, it saves a lot of money. 2% of your GDP dedicated to the military, or 4%, is 100% difference. It's a lot of money. And in times of austerity, we can't really afford to spend all that money. But I would like to take you on.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, exactly. Let's have a bit of a controversy here. What you said about preventive war, I'm not sure I can agree. I think, there was no idea that Eisenhower could embark on preventive war to prevent the Soviet Union from obtaining a nuclear weapon in 1949. First of all, it came out of the blue. It was expected that it would only happen in the mid-1950s. And that was a big power. And when we talk about preventive war on the Bush, then we talk about small powers. We are not talking about a superpower. Even Bush wasn't thinking of having a preventive war against China or Russia, the successor state of the Soviet Union. We talk about a relatively small country, at least in potential terms, like Iraq. And that is the reason why Iran and North Korea have embarked on their nuclear program, because they know if Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, Bush wouldn't have gone in. The same applies to Iran and North Korea. I do believe that is self-protection. It is not the desire to, let's say, attack Israel or whatever. They want to prevent being gotten rid of by some, as they see it, crazy American administration in the future. So I think preventive war now is entirely different. It has to do with small countries, maybe regional powers, but not really with big superpowers as it had in the past.
Did you want to comment on any of this?
Just very briefly, Justin, you also said could NATO have come into being in the 1990s if it hadn't been there. I agree with Klaus. Once it's there, it's very difficult to abolish, and so the more natural route was to redefine its mission, which it's done quite skillfully, I think. If it hadn't been there, it would have been very difficult to set up, no doubt, because it's very difficult to set up international organizations. If it hadn't been for the special circumstances immediately after the Second World War, we would be missing most of the international organizations we currently know. So there's often small windows of opportunities or tremendous functional pressures that you need. Something might or might not have happened, I don't know. I mean, the shock of 2001 was a very, very serious shock. And something might have started then. It was not a very kind of auspicious environment because of the divergences between the US administration then and the European administration. I think they might have tried and it might have failed because of that. So, you know, the beginning years would have been inauspicious. But the threat was very serious and is durable, and that could have created a situation where something NATO-like, some sort of security defense alliance among the two parts of the world that tend to forget that they're so alike and in many, many ways have so many common interests as well as values. Something might have emerged. But you know, counterfactuals is fun to think about and very difficult to think straight about.
Yes.
Do you think that the underlying nationalism is going to continue to prevent Europe from having a common policy? The underlying resurgence of nationalism, sort of promoted by the Greek problem, people saying, "Oh, look at what happens when you let." I was recently in Russia, and the people there that we talked to said that if Gorbachev would run today in Russia, he would get maybe 10% of the vote. They said he's very popular in the West and very unpopular in Russia because he gave away too much, so to speak.
It's a bit like Obama in the US.
Like, maybe the turnout today is a reflection of many people in Chapel Hill think tomorrow the world might end depending on what happens.
So what about that? Nationalism in Europe?
We'll start here? Okay. It depends on which day you ask me. I was giving my bad kind of run on this, you know, emphasizing the Euro crisis as a corrosive force that really has brought back, particularly in public opinion, the fear that the best kind of, or the safest place to hide in times of economic and financial crisis is home, is the national. And what is, in my view, worrying is that you also see this trend in countries that hadn't displayed this, like Germany. Yeah. I mean, for Germany, it's kind of almost written in the genes that what is good for Europe is good for Germany and vice versa. And if that starts to be questioned, which, you know, given the tremendous pressures of the Euro crisis, I think is happening, then, you know, things could unravel in ways that we cannot anticipate. So that's my negative and doom scenario. My other side, which I want to be true, because is that there's a very dense set of institutions and also a very dense set of shared values and norms there. There's also a history of coming out of crises and pushing things forward. If you look at the details of what has actually happened since 2009, when the crisis hit, first with the 2008 with the Lehman Brothers, and then it took about a year before we really knew how that was going to affect the European economies, because at first the European economies seemed to react more flexibly because of the automatic stabilizers. That is, their welfare states were kicking in. The states were taking over the role of providing jobs and providing just simply money to keep the economy going, right? But then, for reasons which I shall not repeat here, things got out of hand, if you like, first in Greece and Ireland, and then in other countries as well. Let me just think, where was I going with this? Yes, but if you then look what has happened since 2010, there's been significant movements on particular things of creating the kind of institutions that were not created when the euro was set up. Economists were telling very clearly in the 1990s, when the euro was thought out and put in the Maastricht Treaty, you're trying to fly without wings. That is, you're trying to set up a eurozone in an area that is not an optimal currency area, that is where the national economies often are out of sync. If you have that, you need to have very strong fiscal institutions so that you can deal with asymmetrical shocks, sorry for the economic language. Essentially, you've got a crisis in a part of the territory and not in the whole. And fiscal institutions is a euphemism for saying you need to have some centralized taxation so you can pay out unemployment benefits in the parts of the economy that are doing badly, or you can...
What you said about banking unions and all these technical steps, of course, makes sense, but the euro crisis was not a technical problem. It was a problem of a lack of will. And I really blame the Merkel government here. If the Merkel government had 2 years ago and said, Eurobonds, of course, we need Eurobonds, the German taxpayer will pay for it. A transfer union that the German taxpayer, or the strongest countries, not of course the Germans just by themselves, but the French and the British and the Dutch and the Belgians to some extent, that they will get together and bail out the Greeks if necessary. That there wasn't that hesitation that we don't know, we may let them go under even if they leave the Eurozone, we will just stand by. If they had 2 years ago, even 3 years ago, if they had really put a decisive foot on the ground and said, that will not happen, the money will be found, the euro crisis would have been over within a few months. So it was not a technical problem like banking union that couldn't agree on that. That is the alibi. That makes Merkel look good. She can then point to Brussels, they are not getting their act together. Who really didn't get her act together was Merkel and the German lack of will. And I've never been a particularly fan of Helmut Kohl, but it wouldn't have happened under Helmut Kohl. It wouldn't have happened if Kohl was still in power. That readiness to do and sacrifice for Europe would have been 200% higher. And that is not in existence under Merkel. And her alibi is European problems. Her other alibi is, oh, the German population will not support it. She never tried to check it out. It is really her lack of enthusiasm and belief in the European project as all her predecessors did. That, I think, is the main reason why we have such a prolonged euro crisis, rather than a short, deep one, and then it's being resolved and overcome, like 6 months, maybe a year max.
Holger, you want to come back then, but okay, but you hear your turn.
Okay. Well, I think this euro crisis links us to the US and to this election most strongly. And the reason why we will get the Troika report on Greece after the election is because Europeans don't want to spill the beans and give bad news on
Before the American election?
Before the American
Yeah.
election, yes. Timothy Geithner was having how many? 200 contacts, phone and personal interviews with Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, with Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. There was most intense shuttle diplomacy going on, and the US lobbied the ECB most strongly over the last year. And I would argue this is one of the main reasons why the central bank usurped the power that is clearly not foreseen in any treaty to buy government debt of Euro countries in crisis. This is an extraordinary measure outside EU law, and I believe it only happened, first of all, because Germany acquiesced, right? Without the tacit consent of the German finance minister and the German chancellor, the ECB could not have gone ahead and bought Italian and Spanish and Portuguese government debt. It came and it immediately relieved the markets. And it did not come too late for the American election. And this is why Timothy Geithner went forth and back. For the Euro crisis coming too late or not, I would just turn to the US as maybe an interesting comparison. And what is it? Only 49 out of the 50 member states of the US are prohibited from running the budget deficit. They're not allowed to run any budget deficit.
It's self-imposed.
For whatever reason. And the federal government does not necessarily always step in when political entity in the US goes bankrupt. The richest county in California, Orange County, went bankrupt, defaulted on its own government debt, its Orange County government debt, right? And no one stepped in, right? The lenders lost their money, period. If a US community defaults, firemen, policemen, teachers lose their pensions. And if they're not insured for the federal system, there isn't even any redistribution through the federal level, right? This is how it looks in the US, and this would be the comparative unity we have to look at, right? Of course, in the Eurozone, we had the Stability Pact as a criteria for entering, right? And this is usually what people mean when they talk about fiscal policy, right? You set a criteria 60% of GDP, that's the maximum budget deficit, 3% of this annual deficit, and so forth. And of course, the numbers were fudged, and Italy and Belgium were let in, even though they did not meet the criteria, but they had the tendency to meet the criteria in the future. And now this is considered the Stability Pact, to give a limit on the public debt. Of course, there is no sovereign political entity that has such a limit. The United States of America has no limit to public debt. Japan has no limit to public debt. It has 200% of public debt compared to GDP. Right? And of course, the central banks of these countries, when shove comes to push, or is it push comes to shove, they will buy it. They will buy the government bonds, and the lenders know this. They know it. Right? Even if inflation sets in, even if the federal
and have to have this vetted by the European Commission. If the European Commission does not agree, does not think this is feasible, this is not working, it will give a negative opinion, which can, and this is a change in the rules, can only be overridden by the Council of Ministers, the Ministers of Economic Affairs, by a qualified majority. The difference in the change in the rules is remarkable. Before it, the rule was that this report had to be supported by a qualified majority in the Council of Ministers. What happened? Those nice governments who always sit together so many times a year and like each other very much and need to deal with each other next year, just didn't dare to or didn't want to punish each other. Right? So the rules have been reversed, which hopefully, and this is just one element in a whole series of packages, will just try to contain what you're really concerned with, rightly, so it's moral hazard. That is that some governments is going to run up deficits that others then intend and you will have to pay for. Now, that will have to come with something. There will have to be probably some greater centralization of fiscal resources. There's now increasing talk about having a separate budget for the Eurozone. We are in budgetary talks now. The UK is out. So the European Union has changed forever. The UK may even leave the European Union, but at the very least it's going to be at the margins. The UK doesn't want to play by the rules. So we're talking here about a separate budget for the Eurozone as such, the 17, and perhaps others who are willing to sign on. What that budget is going to be, I don't know. It may not show up immediately in a 7% GDP tax, a European tax, but it will be something. But what is already there is a fund of several hundred billion of euros that can and will be used in order to give or loan money, it's a loan, it will be loans, to countries in trouble. They will be expected to pay it back at some point as well. So there's things that are happening and they're massive. They will take away or severely constrain economic sovereignty. They're not as strict yet as what is happening within Germany. for example, where the lender, the sub-states, right, will be using their capacity to run deficits, I believe, as of 2016.
Yes, they cannot do it.
Right. So,
But isn't
it
that
goes
all?
in that direction.
You know, I'm totally agree with what you're saying in a way. But isn't that always sad? It sounds as to me we redefine the battle rules, which we are doing. You're quite right. You've outlined it very well. But we may still lose the war. I think the last 2 or 3 years of that prolonged euro crisis have damaged the European idea, maybe even fatally, both within Europe, and you look what you said about the perception of the EU in the United States or other countries, from a strong player, one of the up and rising players, maybe even a challenger to the United States. We talk about some total non-important entity, important in trade things still, but the rest, forget about the EU. And that has been really achieved during the last 2 or 3 years. And even within Europe, look at Germany, that very pro-European country, now it's very skeptical. Greece, Spain, Italy, for obvious reasons, skepticism against the EU and the very European idea has risen a lot. Then you, I don't agree that the UK is not playing by the rules, so let them go. I don't think that is as easy as that.
Oh, no, I think so.
No, okay, yeah, all right.
But I think they will go.
No, but you should try to prevent it. The UK is one of the largest countries in the EU, and we should try to keep them on board, not antagonize them further. By this prolonged euro crisis, we have antagonized or given rise to greater European skepticism in Britain. So I think there's a clear lack of political leadership. While these individual battle rules, they make sense, but they are drawn up by experts. Now they're drawn up, these should have got a clue about banking, to be quite honest, you know. It's the experts, they are pretty good, very sensible. But that what we need from politicians is enthusiasm for the overall project, that people want to keep with it. And by allowing this crisis to go on for much longer than a year I think is the most people can tolerate something like that. If it goes on for 2 or 3 years, you fatally damage the very idea at the heart of it. So you may have the best battle rules, you still see the demise, if you're unlucky, of the European project, of the European idea. So what are the battle rules? They can be as good as they want to be. Largely they won't achieve anything. There's a clear lack of political leadership.
So the cost.
100% agree.